Welcome back and happy April 1st, 2021. Good Friday is tomorrow, and that obviously concentrates the minds of Christians around the world. It also had me thinking about a quote from a famous political scientist, Clinton Rossiter, regarding Abraham Lincoln. He called him the Christ martyr of America's democratic passion play. The Christ martyr of America's democratic passion play. This especially because Lincoln was shot on Good Friday and died on Easter weekend. And it brought me back to this time of year 32 years ago. That's the day I first entered the door of conservatism. That's when I first started to become a conservative, and I can mark it to this day. I was a committed lefty in those days, in early college, and when people asked me to describe my journey, how I went from left to right, liberalism to conservatism, I'm not sure it's that unique of a story, but I'm happy to do it. My biggest worry these days is it may not be replicable for others, at least not in the way I did it. So we're going to have to find other ways. That's a worry, anyway. I'm not exactly sure when I first realized it was seriously time to question the left. As some of you know, that's where I grew up, or what I grew up in, leftism. I was even a member of the Youth Socialist Alliance and went off to college thinking I would bolster my left-wing bona fides and help change the world. I was committed to helping the poor. I believed in keeping sacrosanct the Bill of Rights. I loathed racism. I was a big believer in human rights. I thought welfare should be expanded to help the poor. I thought drugs should probably be legalized. Thought our military buildup was a bad idea. It came at the cost of helping the poor, especially minorities. And I thought tax reform should mean taxing the wealthier more. I think my first questioning of the left I associated with was when I entered a socialist bookstore one day in Tempe, and the first book I saw prominently displayed was titled The Zionist Lie, or something close to that. I leafed through it, and I saw the whole book was itself a lie. An anti-Israel screed that swallowed whole the PLO line that Israel should not exist and that it did exist at the expense of Palestinian human and civil rights. But I had been to Israel several times by then and studied that part of the world. I knew what terrorism was, having studied that as well, as it always fascinated me. And I knew that if human rights were a concern in the Middle East, Israel was the answer, not the problem. That there was no country in the world, and there still isn't, that grants minorities, especially Arabs, more civil and human rights than any other in the Middle East, or perhaps the world outside of America and maybe a few countries in Europe. The more I looked into it, the more uneasy I became with my socialist credentials as I realized the entirety of the PLO, and particularly Yasser Arafat, and every single branch of the PLO, and most other terrorist organizations I could identify, affiliated with socialism and put themselves in league with self-declared socialist countries. I suppose the second thing that got me was a jarring incident that had me seriously and for the first time wondering about how to go about ending racism. I was a freshman in college and took an upper-class psychology course. On my first paper, I received a B-. I had a friend, a senior. He got an A-, and I asked if I could read his paper. It was one of the worst things I ever read. Not necessarily in its conclusions. I could hardly get to those. It was close to illiterate, full of grammatical and spelling errors, just chock full of them. Had I turned in a piece of writing like that in the 5th grade, I'd have gotten an F. I went to meet my teacher to discuss all this, my professor. She said something very close to this. Your paper was a good start, but this is an upper-level course, and you're just not there yet, and you should have integrated X, Y, and Z. Thoughts. I asked about my friend getting an A-, who didn't integrate those thoughts and turned in a piece of work a 5th grader would be ashamed of. And she said, well, I know his background, where he came from. I've had him in my classes before, and he has had just so much growth, and you have to understand his background. What was his background was question one for me. Hispanic American, South Central Los Angeles. That's what she told me. It was something I never thought of. He was just my friend. The second thing I thought, how come the professor didn't give a damn about my background? What did she know of it? I don't have a great word for it, but my friend and I were each judged by our race or ethnicity. I don't have a good phrase for it, but Shelby Steele, some years later, would write exactly what this was, as would George W. Bush. Steele's line about race-based judgments and education leading to what was generally known as affirmative action he called the permanent stigma of questionable competence. Bush's line was the soft bigotry of low expectations. But I knew then, before either of these phrases were known to me, this was all just plain wrong. I had grown up knowing well the then famous Bakke case, and my family was very committed to civil rights, teaching me a ton about Martin Luther King Jr. Almost didn't graduate high school because I almost got kicked out of high school for trying to celebrate his birthday. The Bakke case cited the language I loved, and that all Americans should love. Quote, distinctions between citizens solely because of their ancestry are by their very nature odious to a free people, especially a people dedicated to the notion of equality. I got a quick lesson on what Bakke went through, and I got a quick lesson on soft bigotry, didn't I? Judgments by skin color, permanent stigmas. I became the editor of my college's newspaper. It's actually 5 colleges. It was in Claremont, California, where the 5 colleges share some departments, libraries, and a weekly newspaper, among other things. And there was a famous conservative professor there. I thought he was a right-wing nut. That's what I had been told to believe. He had written some odious op-eds, I had thought, and he was to deliver a major speech that was being promoted. It was titled, "The Reichstag is Still Burning." It was Good Friday, 1989. His speech was a career-spanning discourse on the problems in higher education. I decided I'd go and cover it and see what this idiot was all about. I knew only a little about him, namely that his expertise was supposedly Aristotle and that he had written Barry Goldwater's famous 1964 speech with the lines, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." I went to the auditorium, and I recall another professor I didn't know well at the time, named Charles Kessler, introducing him. I'll never forget Kessler's last line in his introduction of Harry Jaffa. He said, "It is odd that we do this here today on the anniversary of the shooting of Harry Jaffa's favorite political figure, Abraham Lincoln. The difference between Jaffa and Lincoln, though, is that Harry would have shot back." That's always stuck with me. I didn't know Jaffa was a Lincoln lover, much less scholar, but Jaffa approached the microphone and said, "Can everybody hear me?" At which point, about 25 students stood up with signs that read, "Silence equals death," and they walked out quietly as a form of protest. Harry Jaffa then proceeded with his talk, and I wrote an editorial on all of this, saying, quote, "While Harry Jaffa's views are abominable, the protesters should have heard him out and confronted him with questions. If he is so wrong, and he is, they should have showed the world how and why," close quote. The day that printed, I got a call from Dr. Jaffa. He said, "So you think my views are abominable? How about you debate me?" I laughed and said, "Sir, I'm a snot-nosed little sophomore. You're a world-renowned intellect. I don't think I'm going to be debating you." He said, "Well, how about a cup of coffee then?" How could I turn that down? So we met for coffee and talked and talked and talked and talked, probably for 3 hours. I took a class of his. I visited him in his office, often to challenge him. And he walked me through a tour of conservative thought I'd never been exposed to, starting, I think, with Commentary Magazine and, of course, his essays. He gave me his essays on every question I had and spent hours with me discussing them. Long and short, he took my hand, I grabbed it, and never let go. Long and short, I'd never even been exposed to conservative intellectualism. I didn't know it existed, and what did I learn along the way? In short, to use a quote I always loved from Dennis Teddy, a scholar in Washington, D.C., Walter Burns, another great professor of Leo Strauss's, like Jaffa, Walter Burns taught me a professor could love America. Harry Jaffa taught me why. I learned all about how our founding was a beautiful and unique thing. I learned that if I cared about the poor, 2 things mattered, family and education. I learned that if I cared about the poor, the current welfare system which endowed fatherlessness was about the worst thing to do to and for the poor. I learned that school choice and excellence in education was not to be found in the current education system, which had no accountability but cost ever greater amounts to produce ever lesser quality. I learned that if I cared about equality and racism, our Declaration of Independence, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King showed the way. That to get beyond race, you have to get beyond race. That segregation is a badge of slavery and integration is the way out, and that socialists have re-embraced the former, while we, the latter, is something else I came to learn. I learned that if I care about things like the Bill of Rights, minority rights, freedom of association and thought, places like the Soviet Union were the true repressors and oppressors in those days, and that I had been reading propaganda and not listening to the dissidents. That just because something says Pravda, truth, it doesn't mean it is. I learned that if I cared about maintaining this, the last best hope of Earth, the military was the beginning of saving it, not the problem, but a critical necessity. And those who loathed it were in league with those who loathed liberty and equality and all I held dear. I learned, in short, an awful lot. So my worry, they don't make professors like Harry Jaffa anymore. World-class scholars, never mind professors who take that kind of one-on-one time with students. So as you know, I've proposed something else for our evangelization. It's borrowed from the ex-slavery movement. Each one, teach one. It's actually a beautiful sentiment, born of a terrible past. Wikipedia defines it well, as I understood it, and long have. The phrase originated when African Americans were denied education, including learning to read. Many, if not most, enslaved people were kept in a state of ignorance about anything beyond their immediate circumstances, which were under control of owners, the lawmakers, and authorities. When an enslaved person learned or was taught to read, it became their duty to teach someone else, spawning the phrase, each one, teach one. That's where we are ideologically today, with the left denying our ability to educate, to speak, to teach, to debate. So we have to do it ourselves, individually, especially those of us who crossed ideological Rubicons, and let the ideological reservations and plantations of the left in which we used to live be our guiding light and be useful in how we talk to others about making that same journey as we try to show them the way out. And I suggest we start on the issue of race. It is the dominant issue of our time. It is the issue the left thinks can be used against us, and it is fraught with hypocrisy and idiocy and, ironically enough, actual racism. You see, I still think Martin Luther King was right, as I think Frederick Douglass was, and as I think Benjamin Curtis was in his great dissent in the Dred Scott decision, where he said this: "To allege that the founders intended to say that the creator of all men had endowed the white race exclusively with the great natural rights which the Declaration of Independence asserts is a reproach of inconsistency. That whole notion," he said, "was a violation of natural right. As he pointed out, quote, "It has often been asserted that the Constitution was made exclusively by and for the white race. It has already been shown that in 5 of the 13 original states, black persons then possessed the elective franchise and were among those by whom the Constitution was ordained and established. If so, it is not true, in one point of fact, that the Constitution was made exclusively by and for the white race, and that it was made exclusively for the white race is not only an assumption not warranted by anything in the Constitution, but contradicted by its opening declaration that it was ordained and established by the people of the United States for themselves and their posterity. And as free colored persons were then citizens of at least 5 states, and so in every sense part of the people of the United States, they were among those for whom and whose posterity the Constitution was ordained and established." Close quote. The left today can embrace the history of America given to them by Roger B. Taney and the majority of the Dred Scott decision. That's what they do. I never have. I never will. I'll go with Benjamin Curtis's dissent. And I thank Harry Jaffa for starting my journey in understanding all this, as well as for the scholarship. And I thank a system of higher education that once upon a time had the likes of a Dr. Jaffa and allowed students to learn from him. That day is over, so we must think and act anew. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.